Welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadows behind the curtain, into the development rooms and discarded file folders where Five Nights at Freddy's ideas went to rest before they could ever haunt your screen. The franchise you know, with its animatronic terrors and layered mysteries, is built on a foundation of decisions, of paths taken and paths abandoned. But what about those roads not traveled? What about the characters that never made it past concept art? The mechanics that were coded and then deleted? The entire game modes that exist only in buried data files and fading developer notes? This isn't about the lore that made it into the games. This is about everything that almost did. The animatronics that were replaced before you ever knew their names. The gameplay systems that would have fundamentally changed how you experience these digital nightmares. The entire projects announced to the world and then quietly shelved. Every franchise, especially one as prolific and rapidly developed as Five Nights at Freddy's, leaves behind a trail of might-have-beens, and in FNAF's case, that trail is surprisingly long and surprisingly fascinating. What makes this exploration particularly intriguing is how Scott Cawthon's development process evolved over the years. He's been remarkably transparent about his creative journey, sharing in interviews and posts about the iterations and alternatives that led to the final products we've played. Sometimes a feature was cut for technical reasons. Sometimes it was too ambitious for the timeline. Sometimes, and perhaps most interestingly, Scott simply realized that an idea, while functional, didn't serve the experience he wanted players to have. That last category is where some of the most revealing cuts live, because they show us a creator refining his vision, choosing atmosphere over mechanics, fear over complexity. Before FNAF became the phenomenon that would spawn countless games, books, and eventually a major motion picture, Scott Cawthon was a struggling independent developer whose previous game had been criticized for having characters that looked unintentionally creepy. That game was Chipper and Sons Lumber Comics, a family-friendly resource management title starring an anthropomorphic beaver. Critics and players ridiculed the character designs, comparing them to animatronics and calling them scary when they were meant to be charming. The criticism was harsh enough that Scott fell into depression, questioning whether his career in game development had been a massive mistake. But here's where the story takes its fateful turn. Rather than giving up, Scott decided to embrace what people found unsettling about his work. If his characters looked like frightening animatronics, then he would make a game about frightening animatronics. That decision birthed Five Nights at Freddy's, but it also means that buried somewhere in FNAF's DNA is the ghost of that beaver character, and as we'll discover, Scott considered bringing him back more than once. Understanding this origin story is crucial because it reveals something about the development philosophy that would carry through the entire franchise. Scott wasn't afraid to pivot, to scrap ideas that weren't working, to rebuild from the ground up if necessary. This willingness to cut content, to abandon concepts that others might have forced into the final product, is part of what made FNAF successful. But it also means that for every animatronic that stalks you through the cameras, there's another that was designed, modeled, and then deleted. For every gameplay mechanic that keeps you on edge, there's another that was tested and found wanting. And for every game that was released, there were others that were announced, partially built, and then quietly set aside. The world of scrapped content isn't just about satisfying curiosity, though that's certainly part of the appeal. Examining what was left behind gives us insight into the creative process itself, into how ideas evolve and refine. It shows us alternate timelines, where Five Nights at Freddy's might have been a very different experience. Would the series have become as popular if the main antagonist had been that beaver instead of Freddy Fazbear? Would the first game have maintained its tense atmosphere if players had multiple lives instead of one chance per night? Would Security Breach have been the game fans hoped for if all the cut content had made it into the release version? These aren't just hypothetical questions for the sake of speculation. Many of the scrapped elements were actually implemented to some degree before being removed. Code still exists in game files. Voice lines were recorded but never triggered. Entire game modes were built and then disabled. Some of this content has been discovered by data miners digging through the files. Some has been revealed by Scott himself in interviews and posts. And some we only know about through early trailers and screenshots that showed features that mysteriously vanished by release day. What's particularly fascinating about FNAF's scrapped content is how much of it was significant. We're not just talking about minor cosmetic changes or slight alterations to jump scares. We're talking about fundamental gameplay systems, entire animatronic characters that would have changed the roster, story elements that would have altered the narrative, and complete games that were announced to the community and then never delivered. The scope of what was cut is, in some cases, almost as large as what remains. Tonight, we're going to walk through this hidden history chronologically, starting with the original Five Nights at Freddy's and those early character concepts that almost populated the first pizzeria, then moving forward through each major release, uncovering the features, characters, and mechanics that almost were. We'll explore the scrapped movie scripts that took the story in wild directions. We'll examine the massive amount of content cut from Security Breach that reveals an entirely different vision for that game. And we'll discuss the projects that were announced, built to varying degrees, and then abandoned, leaving fans to wonder what might have been. Some of what we'll cover is well documented, confirmed by Scott, or visible in game files. Other elements exist in that murky space of rumor and speculation, supported by evidence but never officially confirmed. Where possible, I'll distinguish between what we know for certain and what remains in the realm of informed guessing. But all of it contributes to a fuller picture of how Five Nights at Freddy's evolved from concept to reality, and how many realities were tested and discarded along the way. So whether you're letting this wash over you as you drift off to sleep, or actively listening to learn about the FNAF that never was, settle in. We're about to explore the development graveyard, where animatronic concepts, gameplay mechanics, and entire games rest in digital limbo, neither fully alive nor entirely forgotten. This is the story of every scrapped FNAF idea you've never heard of, and it begins, appropriately enough, with the character that was almost the face of the entire franchise before Freddy Fazbear ever got his top hat. The original vision, FNAF 1's lost elements, before Freddy Fazbear became an icon, before Bonnie and Chica joined him on stage, before Foxy lurked behind his curtain in Pirate Cove. Scott Cawthon was working with a different cast of characters for what would become Five Nights at Freddy's. The game we know, the one that launched a phenomenon, almost looked very, very different, and it all started with trying to figure out who would be that fourth character. The main lineup was already taking shape. Freddy was the obvious centerpiece, the lead performer who would give the game its name. Bonnie, the guitar-playing rabbit, and Chica, the cupcake-carrying chicken, were joining him. But Scott needed a fourth character, something to round out the cast and add variety to the threats players would face. His first idea was a wolf animatronic. We don't have much detail about what this wolf would have looked like or how it would have behaved differently from the other characters. Scott mentioned it only briefly in interviews, noting that he developed the concept, but then rejected it. The idea of a wolf animatronic wasn't inherently wrong, but for whatever reason, it didn't fit the vision he was developing for the game. After setting aside the wolf, Scott tried again, and this time he drew on the character that had inadvertently started his entire horror game journey, the beaver. Remember Chipper from Chipper and Sons Lumber Co., the character whose allegedly creepy appearance had led reviewers to compare him to an animatronic. Scott decided to lean into that criticism by actually creating a beaver animatronic for Five Nights at Freddy's. This wasn't just a throwaway concept. In his anniversary interview with YouTuber Darko, Scott confirmed that the beaver animatronic was seriously considered, even planned to be the game's main antagonist at one point. The character would have filled that fourth slot, joining Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica as the primary threat stalking through Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. But there was a problem, and it was the same problem that had plagued Chipper and Sons. The resemblance was too direct. Having a beaver as the main antagonist, or even as a fourth character, would have drawn immediate comparisons to his earlier failed game. Players familiar with Scott's previous work would recognize Chipper's influence, and that recognition would undermine the fresh start that Five Nights at Freddy's represented. This wasn't about ego or trying to hide his past work. It was about ensuring that players could experience FNAF without baggage, without being pulled out of the horror by thinking about a failed family-friendly game about lumber management. So the beaver was scrapped, and in its place came Foxy. The pirate fox, with his tattered appearance and unique sprinting mechanic, became an instant fan favorite. His out-of-order status, his curtained pirate cove, his sudden dash down the hallway, all of this worked to create a distinct threat that complemented the other animatronics rather than duplicating their patterns. But if Scott had gone with the beaver, everything would have changed. The fourth animatronic slot would have been filled by a character carrying the genetic memory of Scott's previous failure. And players would have encountered a threat with a very different visual identity and possibly different mechanics. The story of the beaver didn't end with FNAF 1 though. Scott has mentioned that he considered bringing the scrapped beaver and wolf animatronics back in Five Nights at Freddy's 2. According to a question and answer session from October 2014, just after FNAF 2's announcement, Scott stated that the first game's cut animatronic characters were planned to return in the sequel. Whether this meant they would appear as withered versions, toy versions, or in some other capacity, we don't know for certain. What we do know is that they never materialized in FNAF 2, and the concept was once again set aside. But the beaver concept may have found new life years later. In Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, a character named El Chip appeared. El Chip is a beaver animatronic, specifically a Mexican-themed character associated with a restaurant chain. While El Chip's design and role are quite different from what Scott originally envisioned for the beaver in FNAF 1, the connection seems unlikely to be coincidental. Given Scott's history with the beaver concept and his tendency to eventually incorporate scrapped ideas, this could represent his way of finally including a beaver character in the franchise without the baggage of resembling Chipper too closely. Whether intentional homage or interesting convergence, it suggests that character concept, rejected twice, may have ultimately found its place in a form that worked for the franchise. The wolf concept also eventually made its way into the franchise, just not in the main games initially. Twisted Wolf appeared in the novel The Twisted Ones, giving the concept a literary life. More significantly, Roxanne Wolf became a major character in Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach, serving as one of the glam rock animatronics. Roxanne is a guitar-playing wolf with a distinctive personality and significant role in the game's story. So in a roundabout way, both of Scott's rejected early concepts for that fourth animatronic slot eventually found their way into the FNAF universe, just not where or when they were originally intended. Beyond character concepts, the first Five Nights at Freddy's had some significant mechanical changes during development that would have altered the gameplay experience substantially. The most notable of these is the live system. Early beta footage and game files contain evidence of a lives mechanic that would have allowed players multiple attempts at surviving a night before receiving a game over. Specifically, there are textures for lives text and a pixel art stick figure that would display on a life counter. In the game's MFA files, the development source code, this stick figure was referred to as Tiny Man. This live system would have fundamentally changed how FNAF felt to play. Instead of each night being a single, tense attempt where one mistake meant starting over from 12 a.m., players could have taken multiple hits, learning from each failure within the same night. This would have made the game more forgiving, certainly, but it would have also altered the emotional experience. Part of what makes Five Nights at Freddy's so tense is that your time is valuable and your survival is fragile. Every decision matters because there are no second chances. Implementing a live system would have softened that edge, making the game more approachable but potentially less frightening. Scott clearly recognized this because the live system was scrapped before the final release. The files remain in the game's data, and early gameplay footage shows the system in action, but it never made it to the version players downloaded. This decision shows Scott's understanding of what made his game work. He could have kept the live system to make the game more accessible, appealing to players who might be frustrated by the instant death, restart the night approach. But he chose atmosphere and tension over accessibility, betting that the unforgiving nature of the survival would be part of what made the experience memorable. Given FNAF's success, that bet paid off. The camera system also went through iterations. The monitor's early design showed different buttons and a different layout for the camera selection. Instead of the list-style menu that made it into the final game, early versions had small circular icons with cones pointing in the direction the cameras were facing. These cones may have indicated each camera's field of vision, giving players more information about what they could and couldn't see from each angle. When a camera was selected, its icon would turn green and become slightly larger. Some cameras were also placed in slightly different locations on this early map. This version of the camera system would have provided more spatial awareness, helping players better understand the layout of the restaurant and the coverage each camera provided. However, it was also more cluttered and potentially more confusing to parse quickly. The list-style system that Scott ultimately implemented is cleaner and faster to navigate, which is crucial when you're frantically checking cameras to locate animatronics. Once again, Scott refined his design to prioritize the experience he wanted players to have, even if it meant cutting a feature that had already been partially implemented. There were also visual changes to the animatronics themselves. Early endoskeleton designs, visible in trailers and promotional material, included rectangular nostrils that are entirely absent in the final game. Bonnie's endoskeleton head in particular looks slightly different in the early footage. These are minor changes, cosmetic really, but they show the iterative process at work, Scott continually tweaking and adjusting to get the look right. Even location naming went through changes. Early gameplay footage shows the East Hall area labeled as Backstage, named after another location of the same name. Scott later confirmed this was an error on his part, a labeling mistake that was corrected before release. It's a small detail, but it's the kind of thing that matters for consistency and clarity, preventing player confusion. All of these cut elements from the first game reveal a development process focused on refinement. Scott wasn't just throwing ideas at the wall to see what stuck. He was carefully considering how each element contributed to the overall experience. The beaver and wolf were cut because they didn't fit or created unwanted associations. The live system was removed because it undermined the tension. The camera interface was simplified for clarity and speed. Each cut made the game tighter, more focused on delivering the specific kind of horror Scott was aiming for. What's interesting is that many of these early concepts weren't bad ideas in isolation. A live system works perfectly well in many games. A more detailed camera interface could be useful. The beaver could have been a perfectly acceptable fourth animatronic. But not bad isn't the same as right for this specific game, and Scott demonstrated a willingness to cut anything that didn't serve his vision, even if it meant throwing away work already done. This pattern of aggressive cutting and refinement would continue throughout the franchise's development, but it was established here in the first game, where Scott was figuring out what Five Nights at Freddy's needed to be. The game that launched the phenomenon almost had a beaver and a wolf, almost gave players 3 lives, almost used a completely different camera system. Instead, it had Foxy, demanded perfect survival, and presented information in the cleanest way possible. Those choices mattered, and the cut content that led to those choices reveals a developer learning what to keep and what to discard, building a horror experience one decision at a time. FNAF 2's hidden mechanics. By the time Five Nights at Freddy's 2 entered development, Scott Cawthon had a hit on his hands and a community hungry for more. The sequel arrived just 3 months after the original, an incredibly short development cycle that required Scott to work quickly and make rapid decisions about what to include and what to cut. Despite this breakneck pace, or perhaps because of it, FNAF 2 left behind a surprising amount of unused content, including at least one major gameplay mechanic that was fully coded before being disabled. The most significant cut from FNAF 2 is the toxic meter, also known as the breathing mechanic. Hidden in the game's files is a meter labeled toxic, and this wasn't just an asset that was created and forgotten. The mechanic was fully programmed with code that made it functional. Here's how it would have worked. When you put on the Freddy Fazbear head to hide from the animatronics, a toxic meter would begin to fill. Stay in the mask too long, and something bad would happen. The exact consequences aren't entirely clear from the code alone, but the implication is that you would have been forced out of the mask, left vulnerable, or face some other penalty. Scott later confirmed the purpose of this mechanic in a conversation with YouTuber Dowco. He explained that it was designed to prevent players from simply leaving the mask on indefinitely, which would have trivialized some of the game's challenge. With the mask on, most animatronics can't harm you, so without some drawback, players could just sit there in safety. However, Scott felt that having a meter fill up while wearing the mask was too artificial, too obviously game-like. It didn't make intuitive sense why putting on a mask would cause a toxic meter to increase. Was the air inside stale? Was it claustrophobic? The mechanic worked functionally, but felt arbitrary, like a rule imposed by the game rather than a natural consequence of the world. So Scott cut it, even though the work was done, even though it addressed a legitimate gameplay problem. Instead, he solved the issue of mask camping through other means. He made players wind the music box, giving them a reason to lower the mask and interact with the cameras. He made Withered Foxy immune to the mask, forcing players to manage his mechanic differently. These solutions felt more organic, more like they emerged from the characters and the situation, rather than from game balance requirements. The toxic meter, meanwhile, remains in the files, a fully functional mechanic that players would never see without data mining. This decision reveals something important about Scott's design philosophy. He wasn't satisfied with a solution that merely worked. It had to work in a way that felt right, that maintained the game's internal logic and atmosphere. The toxic meter was practical but wrong, so it was scrapped, and better solutions were found. This willingness to discard completed work in pursuit of a better experience is part of what made the early FNAF games so carefully crafted, despite their rapid development. FNAF 2 also has some interesting unused visual assets, including renders and animations that hint at planned but ultimately scrapped behaviors. An unused render of Toy Chica exists, showing her in Party Room 4, and the game's code even includes logic that would display this image if Toy Chica entered that room. However, her AI never actually sends her there. She can go from the main hall to the office hall to Party Room 1, but Party Room 4 isn't on her route in the final game. This suggests that at some point during development, her pathing was different, and she was meant to travel through that room before Scott changed her movement pattern. There's also unused functionality related to Shadow Freddy and Endo 02. The game files contain code for a mechanic where, after you see either of these characters appear in their respective locations, they would disappear after half a second, followed by 3 seconds of static interference. This would have been a unique, unsettling effect, differentiating these rare encounters from the more straightforward animatronic threats. However, due to what appears to be a programming oversight, this mechanic never triggers in the final game. The code exists, the logic is there, but a variable was accidentally set incorrectly, meaning the static effect never activates. It's entirely functional in the files, just never actually used during normal gameplay. Scott considered bringing back the power mechanic from the first game. File names in FNAF 2 reference power-related assets, suggesting that at one point the flashlight or other mechanics might have been tied to a depleting power supply similar to the first game's generator. Ultimately, this was left out, with FNAF 2 instead using a flashlight battery that depletes but recharges when you're not using it. This change kept some resource management without the strict time limit that the first game's power imposed. It's a more forgiving system that allows for longer nights and more strategic camera use, without the constant countdown pressure. There are also some smaller visual differences visible in early promotional material. Mangle's third teaser showed the character with a hook similar to Foxy's hook, but in the actual game, Mangle has both hands and no hook. This wasn't a major gameplay change, but it shows how character designs were still being finalized even as promotional materials were being created. Similarly, the same teaser showed the original Foxy with glossy black eyes and glowing white pupils. A design that looks fantastic in a still image, but was replaced by the withered Foxy design that better fit the game's aesthetic and lore. screenshots released before the game's launch, show some differences in the interface as well. The flashlight's battery meter was visible, but didn't have the flashlight text label that appears in the final version. This is a minor detail, but it's the kind of small polish that gets added as development continues, improving clarity without changing functionality. There are even remnants of the first game's Easter eggs in FNAF 2's code, specifically the Golden Freddy post-game over jump scare and the 1987 custom night code. These elements return as leftovers from the first game's codebase, and while they're set up to trigger under specific circumstances, they have no actual effect in FNAF 2. The 1987 code is particularly interesting. In FNAF 1, setting the custom night AI levels to 1987 triggered a newspaper clipping referencing the byte of 87. In FNAF 2, the code recognizes when you set the withered animatronics to those levels and sets a variable to 1, but nothing happens. It's like a vestigial organ, code that no longer serves a purpose but hasn't been fully removed. The presence of these leftover Easter egg systems reveals something about Scott's development process. He was building a FNAF 2 on top of the foundation he'd created for the first game, carrying over systems and code structures. This is efficient development, reusing what works rather than starting from scratch. But it also means that elements from the previous game can linger in unexpected ways. The fact that these Easter eggs were carried over suggests Scott considered either reusing them or creating new versions, but ultimately decided against it, leaving them as non-functional remnants. The game also has some interesting camera-related unused content beyond Toy Chica's Party Room 4 render. There are alternate camera angles and views stored in the files that show different perspectives on various rooms. Based on what we can observe, some of these might have been tested for cinematic effect, showing animatronics from more dramatic angles, while others could have been functional tests to determine the best views for gameplay purposes. The final camera system in FNAF 2 shows mostly straightforward security camera-style views, but these alternate angles suggest Scott experimented with more dynamic or artistic camera placements before settling on the more utilitarian approach. The game's files also contain several debug counters and objects that were used during development, but disabled for release. There are counters labeled Test 1, Test 3, and Test 4, which were used for various debugging purposes. Test 1 tracked the flashlight battery's lifespan. Test 3 kept track of how much light you'd shone on Withered Foxy, helping Scott calibrate that mechanic. Test 4 exists, but appears to be completely unused, its purpose lost to time. An object called Active 3 exists in the custom night screen, positioned out of bounds where players can't normally see it. If you could click it, it would set all characters' AI difficulties to 20, maxing them out instantly. A variant called Active 4 also exists, but it has no code attached at all, just the graphic. These are clearly developer tools, ways for Scott to quickly test specific scenarios without manually adjusting every character's AI level. The blackout timer counter is particularly interesting because it reveals a programming mistake that left a planned feature unused. The counter was meant for debugging a mechanic where Shadow Freddy and Endo02 would cause signal interference when viewed. The code checks if the blackout timer is greater than or equal to 30, and if so, triggers the static effect and makes the entities run away. However, the code accidentally references this blackout timer, where it should reference another object called blackout in progress, and as a result, the mechanic never functions as intended. It's right there in the code, almost working, but a single error means players never experience it. There's also a mysterious red bar labeled mid-range, located out of bounds next to the animatronics debugging icons. No code is associated with it, and its purpose remains unknown. Was it tracking distance, difficulty, some mechanic that was planned but never implemented? We may never know. Perhaps most intriguingly, there's an unused sprite called Mike in the game files. It's a stylized image of a human skull crying black liquid, positioned among the animatronic debugging icons. No code is attached to it, so we don't know how it was meant to be used, but its file name and location suggest it was planned as some kind of character indicator, or possibly even a scrapped character. Given that the player character in FNAF 1 is named Mike Schmidt, this could be an early idea for representing the player's character in some way, or it could be entirely unrelated. It's one of those mysteries where we have the asset but not the context. All of this unused content from FNAF 2 paints a picture of rapid development, where features were implemented, tested, and sometimes discarded in the rush to get the game out just months after the first. The toxic meter shows Scott refining mechanics even when they functionally worked. The unused renders and animations show character behaviors being adjusted up until the last minute. The debug tools and leftover code from FNAF 1 show a developer building on his previous work, carrying over systems and then modifying them for the sequel. What makes these cuts particularly interesting is that FNAF 2 was developed so quickly. In that compressed timeline, Scott was making constant decisions about what the game needed to be, and he wasn't afraid to cut features that didn't make the cut, even if they were already implemented. The toxic meter was done. The shadow animatronic static was coded. The unused camera positions for Toy Chica were rendered. But done wasn't good enough if it didn't serve the experience. So these elements were disabled, hidden, or removed, leaving behind only traces in the game's files for data miners to eventually discover. The rapid development cycle of FNAF 2, just 3 months after the first game's release, meant that Scott was working under intense time pressure, while also trying to expand and improve upon the formula he'd established. This pressure led to pragmatic decisions about what could be completed and what needed to be cut or simplified. The toxic meter, while functional, required additional UI elements, player education about the mechanic, and careful balancing to ensure it wasn't too punishing or too lenient. Cutting it allowed Scott to focus on elements that were more intuitive and better integrated with the game's atmosphere. The sequel built on the original's foundation, but took the formula in new directions, and along the way, it left behind an alternate version of itself, one with different mechanics and different character behaviors, visible only through the development artifacts that weren't fully deleted. Those artifacts show us a game that was constantly evolving right up until release, being shaped and reshaped until it matched the vision Scott was chasing. Sister Location's secret features. Five Nights at Freddy's. Sister Location marked a significant departure for the franchise, introducing voice acting, a more narrative-focused experience, and a completely different setting. With these changes came a development process that experimented with new ideas, some of which made it into the final game, and others that were built, tested, and then cut. Sister Location's unused content is particularly revealing because it shows Scott trying to evolve the formula while still figuring out what should stay and what should go. The most significant unused mechanic in Sister Location is the glass pressure braking system. Evidence of this feature is scattered throughout the game's files, and it was even hinted at on the game's IndieDB page, which mentioned that players should step away from the glass. In the files, there's an unused voice clip from the female AI where she says, "Glass pressure trigger. Please do not push against the glass." This line was meant to play as a warning in the circus gallery location, where you view the animatronics through large glass windows. Based on the available evidence and the warning message, we can piece together how the mechanic likely would have worked. Players could approach the glass windows in various control modules and galleries, presumably to get a closer look at the animatronics. However, if you pressed against the glass, maintaining pressure for too long, the glass would crack or break, allowing the animatronic on the other side to reach you. This interpretation is supported by both the voice line's explicit warning and the IndieDB page's "step away from the glass" hint. Had it been implemented, this would have added a new layer of risk to observing the characters, turning what seems like a safe viewing position into a potential danger zone. The mechanic was fully voiced and programmed into the game's logic, with code that would trigger the warning based on player position and interaction with specific areas. However, it never made it into the final release. The reasons for cutting it aren't officially documented, but we can make educated inferences based on how Sister Location's gameplay ultimately worked. The game is heavily scripted, with specific sequences designed to play out in particular ways. A mechanic that depended on player behavior at the glass windows might have been difficult to integrate with these scripted sequences without breaking the intended flow. Alternatively, it might have been confusing or frustrating, punishing players for doing something that seems natural, getting a better look at these unsettling characters. Whatever the reason, the glass pressure system was disabled, though the voice line and code remain in the files. It's another example of Scott building a feature, finding it didn't quite work for the experience he wanted, and cutting it even after the work was done. The IndieDB page hint suggests this was cut relatively late in development, after promotional materials had already referenced it. Sister Location also has some fascinating unused voice content, particularly for Funtime Freddy. Voice actor Kellen Goff recorded significantly more dialogue for the character than what appears in the final game. During a live stream with MatPat, Goff revealed that he'd been holding back on sharing Funtime Freddy's unused lines without Scott Cawthon's permission, but once given the go-ahead, he shared some of these alternate takes and cut lines. Most intriguingly, Goff revealed that Funtime Freddy was originally meant to have a German accent. Think about how different that would have made the character. Funtime Freddy is already unsettling with his overly cheerful demeanor and violent suggestions, but adding a German accent would have given him an entirely different flavor, possibly making him even more distinctly memorable. Scott ultimately decided against it, and while the specific reasons weren't publicly documented, the accent might have introduced unintended connotations or simply felt too gimmicky for the character's role in the story. Still, some of Goff's recorded German accented lines exist somewhere, a character interpretation we'll never hear in the actual game. The custom night update for Sister Location brought its own cut content, visible in promotional materials that showed features not present in the actual update. The first teaser for custom night showed Bon Bon, Funtime Freddy's hand puppet, crawling through the vents. It's a creepy image that suggested a new mechanic, where players would need to watch for Bon Bon's independent movement through the facility's air ducts. However, in the actual custom night, Bon Bon never enters the vents. He remains attached to Funtime Freddy, or appears in other contexts. But the vent crawling scenario from the teaser never happens. Whether this was a planned feature that was cut during development, or promotional artwork that took creative liberties to generate interest, the teaser set an expectation that the final product didn't meet. The game's files contain several unused images that hint at cut sequences or mechanics. There's an unused image of Ballora in the primary control module, with her faceplates open and her endoskeleton face exposed, looking directly at the player. This image was meant to display when activating the controlled shock mechanic on Ballora, showing the result of shocking her in a dramatic close-up. However, the final game doesn't use this image. When you shock Ballora, you see different visuals, or the sequence plays out differently. The unused image suggests a more intimate, unsettling view of the shocking process that was ultimately replaced with a less direct approach. Another unused image shows Circus Baby in complete red tinting, with her pigtails obscured or missing. The MFA code reveals this was part of an early game over screen, suggesting that at one point, Circus Baby's jump scare or game over sequence was different, possibly involving this red-tinted, pigtailless appearance. The final game over screens are different, making this image a relic of an earlier design. There's also a curious unused position map that would have been overlaid while in the vents, primary control module, and circus control. This map would have shown players where they were in the facility, helping them navigate the various connected areas. However, Sister Location ultimately didn't include this constant map overlay, relying instead on more contextual navigation. The map image that exists in the files shows a slightly different layout than the final facility, with different room connections. This suggests that the facility's structure went through iterations, with rooms being rearranged or connections being changed during development. Specifically, the unused map shows 2 rooms connected to Fun Time Auditorium and 2 rooms connected to Ballora Gallery, while the final game has 3 rooms connected to each. This is a significant layout change that would have affected navigation and possibly the mechanics involving these areas. The fact that an entire map was created and then the layout was changed shows how even fundamental spatial design was being adjusted during Sister Location's development. The files contain other small unused assets as well. There's an image of iron bars covering the vent to Fun Time Auditorium, labeled Cage in the files. This might have been intended to show that after specific story events, animatronics were locked into their areas, unable to move freely. The bar visual would provide context for why certain animatronics aren't threats during certain nights. An unused image of Bidybab surrounded by darkness exists, suggesting there might have been plans for Bidybab to appear in additional nights or scenarios beyond where we actually encounter them in the final game. Bidybab's role is already creepy enough, hiding under the desk and inside the spring lock suit. But this dark image suggests there might have been other contexts where these small animatronics would appear. There's even an unused voice clip with just the words "motion trigger, technician control." This was another warning from the facility's AI voice, presumably meant to play when certain motion sensors detected activity. Like the glass pressure line, this would have been part of a more interactive warning system that alerted players to various hazards based on their actions. These warnings would have made the facility feel more like a living security system, constantly monitoring and responding to your presence. One of the strangest unused assets is an image labeled "Hello There," showing a creepy smiley face that was never seen in the game. Drawing from both its file name and appearance, This could have been intended as graffiti in the vents or under the desk. A small environmental detail suggesting that other technicians had been in these spaces before you, possibly leaving warnings or descending into madness and drawing ominous symbols. It represents the kind of environmental storytelling detail that would add to the atmosphere without being essential to the gameplay, though its exact intended purpose remains unclear, since it was cut at some point during development. Perhaps the most obscure piece of cut content is a strange screen, accessible only through a very specific, convoluted series of actions in Ballora Gallery. This screen, discovered years after the game's release, shows what appears to be a blue screen with several randomly generated counters and a date function, called frame in the game's files. This screen appears to be some kind of testing or debugging interface that was left in the game's code, but made nearly impossible to access accidentally. Every 10 seconds, there's a 1 in 100 chance that the random number generation stops and displays a date based on your computer's clock, plus a random number of years, creating a near future date. The purpose of this screen remains one of Sister Location's enduring mysteries. It could have been a debugging tool for tracking random number generation during development, an Easter egg that was meant to be discovered through different means, or possibly an in-universe terminal that was connected to mechanics that were later removed. The fact that it exists at all, hidden behind such an obscure sequence of inputs, suggests it wasn't meant for players to find easily, but it also wasn't fully removed from the game, creating one of those peculiar development artifacts that invite speculation. All of this cut content from Sister Location shows a game that was pushing the franchise in new directions, experimenting with more complex mechanics and more narrative integration. The glass pressure system would have added a new type of interaction. The German fun-time Freddy would have created a more distinct character. The expanded voice lines and unused visuals suggest that story sequences were revised multiple times before the final versions were settled on. What's particularly interesting is that Sister Location's cuts seem to be focused on streamlining and simplifying. The glass pressure mechanic was interesting but potentially confusing. The facility map would have been helpful, but might have made navigation too easy. The multiple AI warnings would have added immersion, but also could have become repetitive or annoying. Scott was cutting features that would have added complexity in favor of keeping the experience focused and manageable, even as he was making a FNAF more narrative-heavy than it had been before. The result is a game that feels more directed, more controlled than the earlier entries, but the unused content shows us a version that was even more mechanically complex, with more interactive systems and more ways for players to inadvertently trigger disasters. That version would have been interesting to play, but the version Scott released was the one he thought best served the story he wanted to tell, and once again, features were sacrificed in service of that vision. Help Wanted's virtual revelations. When Five Nights at Freddy's made the leap to virtual reality with Help Wanted, it represented a huge shift for the franchise. Developed by Stillwell Studios with Scott's oversight, the game attempted to adapt the FNAF experience to VR, while adding new minigames and mechanics. The development process for Help Wanted was complex, involving coordination between Scott and an external studio, and a lot of content was created, tested, and ultimately cut or changed before release. Some of these cuts are particularly significant because they would have substantially altered the game's structure and impact. The biggest cut from Help Wanted is Spring Bonnie's role in the pizza party level. In the final game, The Pizza Party level features Glitchtrap as the primary threat, a digital manifestation that will become central to the game's overarching narrative and the setup for security breach. However, Glitchtrap was not the original plan for this level. Assets and code found in the game's files reveal that Spring Bonnie, the actual animatronic character, was meant to appear as the main threat in what was originally called Spring Bonnie, or Fun with Spring Bonnie. The change from Spring Bonnie to Glitchtrap was significant. Spring Bonnie was meant to be an action figure collectible in the prize counter area, along with having a plush unlock. These models exist in the files, showing a fully rendered Spring Bonnie ready to be displayed and interacted with. Additionally, leftover code and an untextured model for Springtrap can be found in the files, labeled in ways that suggest they were connected to this original Spring Bonnie level. Why was this changed? The switch from Spring Bonnie to Glitchtrap recontextualized the entire experience. Having the actual Spring Bonnie animatronic in the level would have made it another standard FNAF encounter, scary but familiar. Introducing Glitchtrap instead created something new and deeply unsettling. A character that didn't play by the established rules, and that would become the seed for the franchise's next major story arc. Glitchtrap's rabbit appearance clearly calls back to Spring Bonnie, creating a thematic connection while being something distinctly different. The narrative implications of this change extend well beyond Help Wanted itself. Glitchtrap became the central antagonist force for Security Breach, with Vanny serving as his follower or vessel. The entire storyline of Glitchtrap infecting people through the VR game and extending his influence into the real world wouldn't exist if Spring Bonnie had remained the Pizza Party threat. The franchise's direction from Help Wanted forward was fundamentally altered by this single character replacement, showing how a seemingly localized cut or change can have franchise-wide ramifications. This decision to replace Spring Bonnie with Glitchtrap probably happened relatively late in development, as promotional materials show Spring Bonnie as part of an animatronic amalgamation in early teasers, before being replaced by Nightmarion in later versions. There's even evidence that Spring Bonnie was intended for the game's ending sequence before Glitchtrap took over that role as well. This wholesale replacement of one character with another across multiple parts of the game shows a major narrative shift that occurred during development, changing the direction of Help Wanted's story and its implications for future games. The Spring Bonnie collectibles that exist in the files but were never made available are particularly interesting because they represent merchandising opportunities within the game that were abandoned alongside the character's gameplay role. The prize counter was meant to be filled with unlockable items that players could earn by completing challenges and finding secrets, and Spring Bonnie's presence there would have made him a reward as well as a threat. By removing these collectibles along with his level appearance, Steel Wool and Scott ensured that Spring Bonnie had no presence in Help Wanted, making room for Glitchtrap to be the surprising, unsettling new element that drove the game's meta-narrative forward. Another significant cut was the blacklight animatronics. These were alternate versions of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, with blacklight paint schemes, and they were originally intended to be in Help Wanted's main content. Funko created action figures of these characters, suggesting they were meant to be prominent enough to warrant merchandise. The main three characters, Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica, have completed models and textures in the game's files, found in the main hub area, but hidden behind completely shut curtains that players can never open. Blacklight Foxy has only an eye texture. The rest of his model's textures are missing from the files. The blacklight animatronics would have appeared in nightmare mode, providing variant characters with different appearances and possibly different behaviors. Their presence would have added variety to replaying levels and given completionists additional challenges to overcome. However, they were disabled before release, visible in the files, but not accessible in the game. The reasons for cutting them aren't officially documented. Technical issues with rendering them in VR might have arisen, or Scott and Steel Wool might have decided they didn't add enough value to justify their inclusion, or their potential difficulty. Spike might have been deemed too punishing for what was meant to be VR's accessible entry into the franchise. Help Wanted also had a controversy involving unused images that were ultimately removed. In early versions and in data miners' discoveries, a slideshow of Showbiz Pizza animatronic photos would appear on the prize counter's television screen after pressing the red button on the exotic Butters basket. These photos were taken by Aaron Fechter, the creator of the Rockafire Explosion animatronic band used in Showbiz Pizza, and Scott had asked Fechter specifically for these images to use in the game. However, fans quickly traced the images back to Showbiz Pizza, and Scott became concerned about the association. In a Reddit post explaining his decision to remove them, Scott clarified that Fechter had been wonderful and helpful, and that he'd hoped the images were obscure enough not to be immediately identified. But Scott didn't want people to think that Five Nights at Freddy's was based on Showbiz Pizza, or to send any negative attention Fechter's way. So despite the images being official, licensed, and already in the game, Scott pulled them from the final release. They remain in the game files in a Hidden Images folder, but they no longer display during normal gameplay. This decision shows Scott being protective of both his franchise's identity and his collaborators. He could have left the images in place, since they were legitimately acquired and added atmosphere to the prize counter, but he chose to remove them to prevent any confusion about FNAF's inspirations and to avoid associating his horror franchise with someone else's work in a way that might cause problems. The Curse of Dreadbear DLC had its own set of cut content. Screenshots showed Dreadbear, the DLC's titular character, appearing in Spooky Mansion's hallway segment, but he never actually does in the final game. Old, unfinished versions of the level icons can be found in the files, showing earlier designs that were refined before release. There was also supposed to be a Build-A-Mangle level in the Spooky Mansion section with Freddles, a variation on existing mechanics. Unused textures for these Freddles exist, different from the standard Freddles, suggesting they would have had unique appearances to fit the Halloween theme. Perhaps most interestingly, the game's files contain data suggesting that multiplayer was considered, or at least tested. File structures and references point to systems that would allow multiple players to interact within the same game space. Whether this was meant to be cooperative, where players helped each other survive, or competitive, where they interfered with each other's attempts, we don't know. The multiplayer features never made it to any release version, but their presence in the files suggests that at some point, Help Wanted was envisioned as potentially more than a single-player experience. The game's ending sequences went through revisions as well. Originally, instead of glitch trap dancing at the end, plushies of all the characters, including Plushtrap, would watch the player perform on stage. The music playing would have been the cut Showtime instrumental instead of the FNAF 2 ending theme. This would have been a more traditional FNAF-style ending, surrounded by the franchise's characters, rather than the more ominous glitch trap presence. Another ending variation involved a direct jump scare from Glitchtrap, rather than the perspective shift that made it into the final game. A placeholder model of Glitchtrap exists showing this early jump scare, with different door models and positioning than the final trapped ending. The evolution of these ending sequences shows Scott and Steel Wool trying to find the right note to end on, balancing fan service with setting up the narrative threads that would carry forward. The Showtime button in the hub was also connected to cut content. Originally, pressing it was supposed to play a full song, presumably the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza main theme. The track was composed and is in the files, but the button doesn't play it in the final game. This would have been a nice atmospheric touch, letting players trigger the restaurant's theme music, but for whatever reason, it was disabled. Help Wanted's cut content is particularly significant because it shows the challenges of adapting FNAF to a new format and working with an external developer. Decisions about what to keep and what to cut weren't just about Scott's singular vision anymore, but also about what worked in VR, what was technically feasible, and what served the narrative direction being established. The Spring Bonnie to Glitchtrap switch represents a major story pivot. The blacklight animatronics cut shows mechanics being removed, even when they were mostly finished. The Showbiz Photos controversy demonstrates the care taken to protect the franchise's identity. All of these cuts and changes resulted in a game that successfully brought FNAF into VR, while planting seeds for Security Breach's story. But the unused content shows alternate paths that were explored and ultimately abandoned in favor of the experience players received. Each cut brought the game closer to its final form, and that final form became the foundation for the franchise's continued evolution, even as it left behind these development artifacts as evidence of the journey. Special Delivery's abandoned systems, Five Nights at Freddy's AR. Special Delivery brought the franchise to mobile devices with an augmented reality twist, having players defend against animatronics that appeared in their real-world environments through their phone cameras. Developed by Illumix, the game represented yet another major departure in format for FNAF, and with that departure came ambitious plans for features that were partially implemented before being cut or abandoned. The most significant unused system in Special Delivery is the PvP patrolling mode. Evidence of this feature is scattered throughout the game's code and text files, showing that Illumix planned a player versus player system where players could dispatch their animatronics to battle those sent by friends. The concept would have added a competitive element to what was otherwise a primarily single-player experience. You would select an animatronic from your collection, customize it with specific mods and settings, and send it to a friend's game as a challenge. The unused mods found in the files reveal more about how this would have worked. These mods were designed specifically for PvP encounters and included mechanics that would make animatronics more effective against other players. Most intriguingly, the code suggests that Remnant would be forfeited if your animatronic was defeated, adding real stakes to these encounters. Remnant is the game's premium currency, the stuff you can buy or earn through gameplay. So having it be on the line would have made PvP battles meaningful and potentially stressful. This PvP system would have fundamentally changed how Special Delivery was played, transforming it from a game where you collected animatronics and faced AI challenges into one with an active competitive community. Players would have needed to strategize not just about surviving encounters, but about how to build and deploy animatronics that could succeed in attacking others. The social dynamics would have been fascinating, with friendships tested through repeated animatronic battles. So why was it cut? Mobile game development is complicated, especially for AR experiences that depend on device capabilities and network connectivity. Adding real-time or asynchronous PvP would have required robust server infrastructure to handle player matchmaking, animatronic deployment, result tracking, and remnant transfers. For a smaller studio like Illumix, this might have been beyond their resources or timeline. Alternatively, testing might have revealed balance issues, or that the feature simply wasn't fun enough to justify the development cost. Whatever the reason, the PvP system was disabled, though its fingerprints remained throughout the code. Another major scrapped feature was the crafting system. File structures and code references show that Illumix developed a system where players would gather materials and use them to craft items, probably mods, lures, and possibly even animatronic parts. This would have added a progression layer beyond just winning encounters and opening loot boxes. Instead of purely random rewards, players could work towards specific goals by collecting the right resources and crafting what they needed. The crafting system would have given players more agency and made the grind feel more purposeful. Rather than hoping for the right drop, you could craft toward it, turning luck-based progression into at least partially skill and time-based progression. However, implementing crafting well requires careful balance to prevent it from becoming too grindy or too generous. And Illumix apparently decided that the system they developed didn't hit the right balance, or that the resources required to finish and maintain it weren't worth the benefit it provided. The visibility alter effect is another fascinating unused mechanic. Around the time of Shamrock Freddy's debut, Illumix was developing this system that would create a prefab entity tracking the animatronic, while it gazed at the player during circling or pause states. Based on the name and parameters for distance and Y offset, it seems this mechanic was intended for Endo02, who was rumored to be releasing after Mangle but never appeared. The visibility alter effect suggests that Endo02 would have had unique behavior, possibly becoming visible or invisible based on proximity or view angle, creating a hide-and-seek dynamic where you'd need to manage your position and perspective carefully. This would have been a distinctive mechanic requiring different strategies than the standard animatronics, making Endo02 a unique challenge. However, Endo02 never released, and the visibility alter effect never made it to implementation, leaving only the code structure as evidence of what was planned. The game's reward system also went through changes. Beta versions and promotional screenshots show that prizes were originally going to be delivered in Faz crates, colored bronze, silver, and gold, with rarity determining the quality of rewards inside. When opened, a purple star-shaped balloon would jump out. This system was replaced by the balloon rewards that actually shipped, a simpler visual presentation without the crate opening ceremony. The crate system might have taken longer to implement than the simpler balloon pop, or Illumix might have found that opening crates got repetitive and added unnecessary steps between completing encounters and receiving rewards. Ballora, added in the Dark Circus DLC, has an unused animation showing her fully uncloaking and twirling around the player. This suggests that Ballora's encounter was originally meant to be more dynamic, with her revealing herself and performing her signature spin during the battle. Instead, she remains cloaked or partially visible for most encounters, making them less visually dramatic but possibly more unsettling due to her partial presence. The unused animation shows a more theatrical approach that was abandoned in favor of something subtler. There are also references in the code to various animatronics that were confirmed at some point but ultimately scrapped entirely. These characters were planned, possibly modeled, potentially even programmed to some degree, but never released. Some were likely cut due to balance concerns, others because their mechanics didn't work well in AR, and others possibly because of resource limitations or changing priorities for the game's content roadmap. The remnant icon originally used a swirl design, visible in sneak peek screenshots of RGWQFSFASSXC, Shadow Bonnie. This was changed to the red crystal design in the final game. The flashlight also had an on-off caption in early versions that was removed, simplifying the interface. These are minor changes, but they show the kind of iterative polishing that happens throughout development as UI elements are refined. Special Delivery's unused content reveals the ambitions and challenges of bringing FNAF to AR on mobile devices. The PvP system would have been a major feature requiring significant infrastructure. The crafting system would have added depth to progression, but needed careful tuning. The Visibility Alter Effect and Endo 02 show individual animatronics being designed with unique mechanics. All of these were cut or abandoned, leaving a game that's more streamlined, but also more limited than what was envisioned. The fact that so much was cut from Special Delivery might explain some of the community's mixed reception to the game. Players could sense that there was supposed to be more, that systems felt incomplete, or that promised features never materialized. The code itself tells the story of a development that aimed high, implemented ambitiously, and then had to scale back to ship something functional and maintainable within the team's resources. Security Breach, the game that could have been Five Nights at Freddy's. Security Breach was the most ambitious entry in the franchise to that point, offering free roam gameplay in a massive, sprawling pizzaplex, fully modeled characters, and a more adventure game-like structure than previous entries. It was also, by far, the most troubled in terms of cut content and unfinished features. The game that released in December 2021 was missing massive amounts of content that had been planned, built, and then either disabled or removed. The scale of what was cut from Security Breach is staggering, revealing a game that was drastically different in earlier versions of development. The most significant cut from Security Breach is Vanny's spawning mechanic. As the game's advertised main antagonist, Vanny was supposed to be an active, persistent threat throughout the pizzaplex. In the final release, she appears only in specific scripted sequences and is rarely actually hunting Gregory outside of designated areas. However, code and assets in the game's files reveal that Vanny had a fully functional spawning system that was disabled before release, likely in summer 2021. The mechanic worked like this. As you moved through the pizzaplex, a hidden meter would fill based on various factors like time spent in an area, noise made, or security bots you alerted. Once the meter reached full, Vanny would spawn and begin actively hunting you, independent of the scripted encounters. If Vanessa was active in the same area, she would transform into Vanny when the meter filled, creating a dynamic where you couldn't tell if the security guard approaching you would suddenly become the rabbit-masked killer. This system can still be activated using debug tools, proving it's fully implemented in the code, just disabled. Ray McCaffrey from Steelwool Studios confirmed they initially thought the spawning mechanic not working was a bug, implying it was disabled very close to release. He mentioned plans to add it back in an update, but Steelwool later stated that Security Breach was complete, meaning the spawning mechanic would remain cut. The absence of Vanny's spawning mechanic drastically changed Security Breach's experience. Instead of a horror game where you're constantly aware that the main antagonist could appear at any moment, it became a game where you navigate from one scripted sequence to the next, with Vanny showing up only when the story demands it. Her role as a threat was minimized to the point where many players barely encountered her outside of cutscenes. The fully functional hunting AI that exists in the files represents an entirely different game. One where Vanny actually lived up to her billing as the primary danger. Burntrap, the game's version of William Afton, was also meant to have a much larger role. In the final game, he appears only in the ending sequence, fighting you in a brief monitor office section. But the game's files contain assets for a full chase sequence where Burntrap would pursue you through areas beyond the office. He has animations and AI programming for extended encounters, and he even has a unique death animation that never gets used because the final game skips past his expanded sequence directly to the ending cutscene. This means that at one point, the Burntrap ending was longer and more involved, probably featuring you fleeing through the underground areas while Burntrap stalked you. This would have given weight to the confrontation with Afton's latest form and made the ending feel more substantial. Instead, players get a brief, confusing encounter that feels like the beginning of a larger sequence that was truncated, which is exactly what happened. Perhaps the most disappointing cut is the extras menu. A fully functional extras menu exists in the game's files, accessible with modding, but not through normal play. This menu includes tabs for survival mode, minigames, office games, character gallery, DLC, and credits. Each of these represents cut content or planned features that never materialized. Survival mode is particularly substantial. The menu allows you to adjust difficulty, hour length, and the number of lives Gregory has. The game would raise security levels in various rooms and place party bots throughout major areas, forcing you to navigate the Pizzaplex with heightened threats and specific objectives. This would have provided substantial replay value, giving players a reason to return to the Pizzaplex after completing the story to test their skills with customized challenges. The mode was built, balanced, and ready to go. But it was disabled before release and never re-enabled. The character gallery was even built as an explorable map, not just a simple model viewer. Data miners have accessed this gallery, finding that it has set poses for most characters instead of default A or T poses, meaning significant work went into presenting each model. The gallery would have let players examine the animatronics, human characters, and other models in detail, appreciate their designs, and possibly find Easter eggs or lore details hidden in the models themselves. Previous FNAF games have included similar galleries, sometimes with schematics and hidden messages, making Security Breach's missing gallery a significant loss. The Minigames tab hints at additional minigames that were planned but never finished or were removed. The game does include some minigames, like Phaser Blast, but others appear to have been cut. Most notably, there's evidence of racing and bowling minigames tied to Roxy Raceway and Bonnie Bowl that never made it to completion. Roxy Raceway has unused voice lines from Gregory, and others referencing a kart racing section where you'd actually race against Roxy. The track exists, the race mechanics were partially implemented, and character dialogue acknowledging the race was recorded. But you never race in the final game. You navigate through Roxy Raceway as part of the story, but the actual racing minigame that would have been the area's centerpiece was cut. This explains why Roxy Raceway feels somewhat empty in the final game, lacking the interactive element that was supposed to be its main attraction. Similarly, Bonnie Bowl has a bare-bones bowling minigame in its files with very few polished features, suggesting it was cut early in development. The area exists as a location you visit, but without the bowling activity that would have given it purpose beyond being a place to walk through. Phaser Blast includes the laser tag minigame, making the absence of racing and bowling particularly noticeable, as the other two major attractions lack their defining activities. The Pizzaplex's layout was originally far more interconnected than what shipped. Level 10 security doors exist throughout the facility, inaccessible in the final game, that would have connected major areas through utility corridors called utilidors. These passages would have linked Rockstar Row to Roxy Raceway, created a path between Roxy Raceway and Phaser Blast, connected the Superstar Daycare to Monty's Gator Golf, and provided various other routes between areas. Whitebox maps and out-of-bounds explorations show these massive hallway systems, some as large as the rooms they connect. Having them accessible would have fundamentally changed navigation, allowing players to move between areas without taking the main paths, creating opportunities for stealth and alternate routes when animatronics blocked primary corridors. The fact that they were built and then sealed shows how much of the original interconnected design was abandoned in favor of more linear, controlled navigation. Some of these utilidors appear in the Tales from the Pizzaplex book series, proving they were part of the canonical Pizzaplex design even though players can't access them in the game. The books reference the Roxy Raceway utilidor specifically, and later stories mention the loading dock and sewer connections, suggesting these areas were meant to be significant to both the game and the broader lore. The game's unused dialogue is extensive, with hundreds of voice lines that provide context for cut sequences or alternate story beats. Gregory has lines about going after Roxy that don't match anything in the final game, suggesting a different confrontation sequence. He has unused dialogue about his arm bleeding, and even a line where he cries, implying there were more intense or emotional story moments that were removed. Vanessa's unused lines are particularly revealing, including dialogue where she expresses hope that she can find Gregory before something bad happens to him, and a line where she calls directly to Monty, Chica, and Roxy by name. These suggest that Vanessa's portrayal was originally much closer to the PlayStation 5 trailer's version, where she seemed protective and concerned, rather than the more aggressive, Vanny-like demeanor she has in much of the final release. The Ruin DLC's cut content shows that even the post-release content went through significant changes. The sinkhole section of the DLC was originally much smaller, with different room layouts and connections. The Mimic's Chamber was vastly different, featuring the original animatronics performing on stage rather than the creepy, empty space with a single table that made it into the final version. This earlier design with the band on stage might have been placeholder assets, but it suggests a different aesthetic and atmosphere for the final confrontation. Ruin also had cut minigames related to node breaching, suggesting that the mechanic of disabling security nodes was originally more involved, possibly requiring puzzle solving or skill-based challenges rather than the relatively simple process that shipped. Early versions of these minigames exist in the files, but were simplified or replaced before release. El Chip's restaurant was originally connected to the arcade, but was separated in the final game, with a corridor between them acting as a loading screen. Early teasers and trailers show the direct connection, so this change happened relatively late in development. It's a small alteration in the grand scheme, but it's indicative of how the Pizzaplex's layout was constantly being adjusted, with connections being made and broken to manage technical performance and pacing. There's even cut content related to Chica. An unused Chica shrine exists in the files, and small details throughout Roxy Hall were modified or removed, suggesting that areas were being polished and adjusted right up until release. Some rooms have windows in the files that don't appear in the playable areas, like a Bonnie Bowl window that would have overlooked Roxy Raceway, creating visual connections between areas that were sealed off in the final version. The sheer volume of security breaches cut content tells a story of a game that was far too ambitious for its development timeline and resources. Features were built and then disabled when it became clear they couldn't be finished properly. Entire systems were removed when performance issues made them untenable. Story sequences were cut when the narrative needed to be simplified. The result is a game that feels incomplete because it literally is incomplete, with massive amounts of content existing in the files, but inaccessible during normal play. What makes Security Breach's situation particularly complicated is the timeline of its development and release. The game was originally announced with a late 2020 release window, then delayed to early 2021, then pushed again to late 2021, before finally releasing in December 2021. Each delay suggested that more content was being added or polished, but what actually happened, based on the cut content evidence, is that features were being removed or disabled to get the game to a state where it could run on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 hardware. The performance issues that plagued Security Breach at launch, the bugs, glitches, and frame rate problems, suggest that even with all the cut content removed, the game was still pushing the limits of what the hardware could handle. If all the cut features had been left in, if Vanny spawning was active, if the utilidors were all accessible, if the survival mode was enabled, the game might have been completely unplayable on base PlayStation 4 consoles. The cuts weren't just about unfinished content, but about making the game functional. This creates a tragic situation where the vision for Security Breach was always going to exceed what could be practically delivered. Steelwool Studios, working on their first major FNAF project and their most ambitious game to that point, aimed for something that would have required more time, more resources, and more powerful hardware than they had available. The game that released is what was salvageable from that over-ambitious vision, a compromised version that works but never reaches its potential. The community's response to Security Breach has been notably divided. Some players enjoyed the experience despite its flaws, appreciating the new direction and the glimpses of what the game was trying to be. Others were deeply disappointed, feeling that the game failed to deliver on its promises and that the technical issues overshadowed any positive elements. The knowledge of how much content was cut only intensified these reactions, as players realized they were experiencing a fraction of what had been planned. Steelwool's statements about Security Breach being complete, despite promises to restore cut features, suggest that the development challenges were severe enough that going back to finish everything would have required more resources than were available. The game that could have been, with Vanny actively hunting you, Burntrap pursuing you through multiple areas, fully functional racing and bowling minigames, interconnected utilidors, and a more substantial story told through all that unused dialogue, represents a version of Security Breach that likely never could have shipped in any reasonable timeline. The Ruin DLC, released months after the base game, did add some content and addressed some criticisms, but it didn't restore the cut features from the main game. Instead, it told a new story with new areas and mechanics, expanding the Pizzaplex experience rather than fixing what was missing from the original. This approach makes sense from a development standpoint, as it's easier to create new, focused content than to resurrect and integrate old, disabled systems, but it means that the security breach that was originally envisioned will never actually exist as a playable experience. This is perhaps the most tragic case of cut content in the entire FNAF franchise, because unlike other entries where features were cut to refine the experience, security breaches cuts seem to have been driven by necessity, by technical limitations and development realities that forced features to be abandoned even when they were nearly finished. The game that released is still enjoyable for many fans, but the game that was planned was something else entirely, and the gap between intention and reality is wider here than anywhere else in the series. Subsribe, Into Madness, and other cancelled projects. Not all cut content comes from features removed during active development. Sometimes entire games are announced, teased, and then quietly cancelled or indefinitely postponed. Five Nights at Freddy's. Into Madness is the most prominent example of this in the franchise, a project that Scott Cawthon revealed and then almost immediately put on hold, leaving fans wondering what might have been. Into Madness was first announced on August 5th, 2019, during the original game's 5th anniversary. Scott described it as a compilation of several previous gameplay ideas, suggesting it would collect mechanics or concepts from earlier FNAF entries, and possibly some that had been considered but never used. The plan was for Scott to develop it himself as a personal project, something he would work on independently rather than with Steel Wool Studios or another partner. However, in that same announcement, Scott stated that Into Madness was on hold indefinitely. He wasn't cancelling it outright, but acknowledging that it wasn't a priority and might never come together. He mentioned that it could potentially become a project for Steel Wool Studios in the future, but there were no concrete plans for that transition. The announcement was essentially a soft cancellation, revealing a project only to immediately say it might not happen. What makes Into Madness particularly interesting is that traces of it appear in Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. Data miners discovered that the Balloon World minigame, an arcade game featuring Balloon Boy that you can play in Security Breach, has its files stored in a folder labeled Scott Into Madness. This suggests that either Into Madness was partially repurposed for Security Breach, or that Balloon World was originally developed for Into Madness and then incorporated into Security Breach, when it became clear Into Madness itself wasn't happening. Balloon World is a simple 2D platformer, charming but basic, and if it represents the type of gameplay Into Madness would have featured, the game would have been a departure from FNAF's typical style. A compilation of minigame-style experiences rather than a survival horror game would have been an interesting experiment, potentially showcasing Scott's versatility and giving fans something lighter and more arcade-like than the main series. The Balloon World connection raises questions about whether other parts of Into Madness were absorbed into Security Breach. Without official confirmation, we can only speculate whether other minigames or mechanics in Security Breach might have originally been developed for Into Madness. The Phaser Blast laser tag, the Princess Quest arcade games, the various collectibles and objectives scattered throughout the Pizzaplex. Any of these could potentially have originated from Into Madness concepts before being integrated into the larger game, though there's no concrete evidence to support these connections beyond the documented Balloon World link. The question of what happened to Into Madness remains unanswered. Scott has not provided further updates, and with his stepped-back role in active game development following 2021, it's unlikely that Into Madness will ever be completed, at least not in the form originally envisioned. The project exists in that liminal space of announced but not cancelled, technically on hold rather than dead, but with no realistic path to completion, given the franchise's current direction and Scott's reduced hands-on involvement in day-to-day development. Into Madness isn't the only FNAF project that was announced and then didn't happen as planned. Five Nights at Freddy 6 had a fake cancellation that was actually brilliant marketing. On July 3rd, 2017, Scott announced the cancellation of a sixth main installment after previously stating just a month earlier that it was in development. He explained that he had been neglecting other aspects of his life and needed to step back, but he wasn't planning to abandon the series entirely and was considering a FNAF world-styled spin-off instead. Many fans took this announcement at face value, believing that FNAF 6 was truly cancelled and that the series might be taking a lighter, more experimental direction. Then, on December 4th, 2017, Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator was released, revealing that the cancellation had been a ruse. FFPS was FNAF 6, a full main entry disguised as a spin-off and released as a surprise. The fake cancellation was part of the game's marketing and thematic presentation, playing into the idea of Fazbear Entertainment as a company, trying to rebuild its image by making things seem more casual and business-oriented. This fake cancellation is cut content in a meta sense, the announcement itself being a piece of content that was intentionally misleading. It shows Scott's willingness to play with expectations and use announcements as part of the narrative experience, not just a straightforward communication about development plans. There have also been various fan games and collaborative projects that were announced or hinted at, but never fully materialized, though these fall outside the scope of official FNAF content. Scott has been supportive of the fan game community, even establishing the Fazbear Fanverse initiative to officially support and fund certain projects. However, not all announced projects under that initiative have been completed or released on schedule, showing that even officially sanctioned fan games struggle with the same development challenges that affect the main series. The cancelled and indefinitely postponed projects in FNAF's history show that game development is unpredictable. Even when a creator wants to make something, even when a project is announced and has community anticipation behind it, circumstances can prevent completion. Into Madness remains the biggest question mark. A game that was real enough to have code and assets that made it into Security Breach, but not real enough to ever become its own release. What makes these cancellations and postponements notable is that Scott has generally been transparent about them. He didn't let Into Madness linger as a promised project with no updates. He announced its hold status immediately. When he decided FNAF 6 would be a surprise, he created a fake cancellation rather than just going silent. This level of communication with fans, even about cancelled content, is relatively rare and appreciated by the community, even when the news isn't what people hope to hear. The fate of Into Madness and the fake cancellation of FNAF 6 are reminders that the cut content in this franchise isn't just features within games, but sometimes entire games themselves, projects that existed in planning stages or early development before being set aside. These abandoned projects add to the mythology of what FNAF could be. Alternate timelines where different games or approaches filled the spaces between releases, adding to the already substantial list of what might have beens. Maantiki, the movie that never was, multiple times. While not game content, the Five Nights at Freddy's movie had such a tortured development history with multiple scrap scripts that it deserves examination alongside the cut game content. Warner Brothers acquired the film rights in 2015 shortly after the first game's explosive success, and for years, the project languished in development hell, going through numerous writers, directors, and completely different screenplay approaches before finally releasing in 2023. The journey from acquisition to release was 8 years, and during that time, several completely different movies were written, planned, and then discarded. Scott Cawthon shared details about some of these scrapped screenplays in a 2020 Reddit post titled "Bad News About the FNAF Movie." In that post, he outlined several approaches that had been tried and why each was ultimately rejected. His candidness about these failed attempts gives us a window into how difficult it was to adapt FNAF's premise and atmosphere to film format while satisfying Scott's vision, the studio's needs, and fan expectations. The first scrapped screenplay Scott described involved a group of teenage troublemakers breaking into Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, where chaos ensues. Scott noted that while the setup was pretty basic, there were odd choices throughout that got weirder as the story continued. The screenplay ended with the protagonists in a secret underground animatronic factory, designing robots for the government. Scott's response to this was emphatic. The script strayed way too far from the source material and was immediately tossed. This screenplay represents perhaps the most misguided approach to adapting FNAF. The games are about night shift security guards trapped in a building with haunted animatronics, facing a simple but terrifying scenario. Teenagers breaking in shifts the protagonists to people who chose to be there, eliminating the trapped worker element. The government robot factory ending sounds like something from a completely different franchise, introducing sci-fi conspiracy elements that have nothing to do with FNAF's ghost story horror. That this screenplay was seriously considered shows how disconnected early attempts were from what made the games work. The second attempt Scott called Plushies Take Manhattan. He provided no details beyond the title and a verdict: burned with fire. We can only imagine what this screenplay involved, but the title suggests something light-hearted or comedic. Perhaps animatronics or plush toys coming to life in New York City. The lack of detail and harsh dismissal suggest it was so far off base that Scott didn't even want to acknowledge its specifics. It's the screenplay equivalent of the beaver animatronic, something that seemed like a good idea to someone, but was fundamentally incompatible with what FNAF is. The third attempt involved Charlie and friends sneaking into Freddy's after hours to retrieve a lost toy. Scott noted that although these characters shared names with characters from the games and books, they had nothing to do with their counterparts. While this screenplay featured familiar elements of the games, it felt too loosely based on the source material and lost impact because of it. Scott's verdict felt like a random bag of FNAF elements with no real stakes. This approach shows another common adaptation trap: keeping surface details while missing the essence. Having characters named Charlie doesn't make it a FNAF story if those characters behave nothing like their game counterparts and exist in a different narrative context. Sneaking in after hours to retrieve a toy is stakesless compared to being trapped overnight for your job while animatronics hunt you. This screenplay probably read fine as a generic kids in danger story, but failed as a FNAF adaptation because it didn't understand or preserve what makes the franchise distinctive. A fourth scrapped screenplay involved a kid who watches after a pawn shop, finding trouble when an animatronic is brought in after Freddy's was robbed, and the animatronics were taken to different locations for sale. The animatronics come to retrieve the one at the pawn shop, and the kid and his friends get roped into an adventure. Scott's assessment was that it was a creative approach, but felt too much like a boy and his animatronic, Too much after-school adventure and not enough horror. This screenplay actually has some merit as an idea. Animatronics being stolen and distributed to various locations is a decent premise, and having them actively seek to reunite could work. But as Scott recognized, it tips too far into adventure territory, making the animatronics almost heroic in their quest, rather than the threats they need to be. It's the kind of screenplay that might have made a decent family film, but wouldn't have satisfied FNAF fans looking for actual horror. Scott and author Kira Breed Risley worked on 3 versions of a Silver Eyes screenplay over about a year, trying to adapt the novel to film. Scott described this as diving deep, packing in lots of lore and following Cassidy's story across multiple time periods, featuring multiple characters and incorporating lore from multiple games. The problem was that it became too saturated to a fault. It might have satisfied hardcore fans, but would have left the majority of people confused and lost. The Silver Eyes represents a different kind of failure, where the adaptation attempted to be too faithful or too comprehensive. FNAF's lore is notoriously complex, with layered mysteries, multiple timelines, and characters whose identities and significance aren't immediately clear. Trying to cram all of that into a 2-hour movie creates pacing and clarity issues. What works in a book where readers can take their time to process information doesn't necessarily work in a film that needs to maintain momentum while remaining accessible to people unfamiliar with the franchise's deep lore. Beyond these specific examples, Scott mentioned that there were other attempts and approaches that didn't work out, some that he didn't even detail in his post. The overall picture is one of repeated failures to find the right balance between honoring the source material and creating something that works as a film. Too faithful to the game's minimal plots and static scenarios wouldn't provide enough story. Too loose with the elements creates something unrecognizable. Too lore-heavy confuses general audiences. Too simplified disappoints fans. The movie that finally released in 2023, after these years of development hell and failed scripts, took a different approach. It focused on Mike Schmidt, a troubled security guard dealing with trauma and family issues, who takes the night shift at an abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The animatronics are threats, but also connected to missing children, blending the game's ghost story elements with a more personal narrative about Mike's past. It's not a direct adaptation of any game or book, but draws elements from across the franchise while telling a story that works cinematically. The reception was mixed, with critics generally negative, but audiences responding more positively, particularly fans of the games who appreciated the references and Easter eggs. More importantly, it was a massive financial success, grossing over $296 million and ensuring that a sequel would be made. The sequel was confirmed, with Scott writing the screenplay and a release date of December 2025. Whether the sequel will benefit from the lessons learned during the first film's long development or will face new challenges remains to be seen. The scrapped FNAF movie scripts are a different kind of cut content than the game assets and mechanics we've mostly discussed, but they're equally revealing about the creative process and the challenges of adapting a simple but effective concept to a different medium. Each failed screenplay represents hours of work by professional writers, story meetings, revisions, and ultimately the decision that this version wasn't right. The movie that made it to theaters in 2023 exists because all of those other versions were rejected, because Scott and the filmmakers kept trying until they found something that worked well enough to produce. The fact that it took 8 years and numerous completely different approaches shows just how difficult it was to crack the FNAF movie's code. The game's strength is their simplicity. You're a guard, you have limited tools, animatronics want to kill you, survive until 6 a.m. That elegant simplicity doesn't automatically translate to film, where you need character development, dialogue, a 3-act structure, and enough plot to fill a feature runtime. Every attempt to expand that simple premise either went too far in strange directions or didn't go far enough to be dramatically satisfying. The scrapped screenplays are also reminders that even when a project eventually succeeds, the path there is rarely straight. The FNAF movie came out, made money, pleased enough of the audience to be considered successful. But it only exists because multiple other versions were discarded, because Scott was willing to keep rejecting approaches until one finally fit. That willingness to say no, to keep looking for the right version even when it meant years of delays and frustrated fans, mirrors his approach to game development, where features and characters are cut if they don't serve the experience, even when they're already built. Ultimate Custom Night and Pizzeria Simulator Secrets. While Ultimate Custom Night and Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator aren't the most cut content-heavy games in the franchise, they still had some interesting elements that were planned or partially implemented before being removed or changed. These cuts are particularly interesting because both games represented culminations of narrative threads and gameplay ideas, making the exclusion of certain elements noteworthy. Ultimate Custom Night had some character-related changes visible in early promotional materials. The game's first teaser showed Candy Cadet from Pizzeria Simulator and Adventure Endo 01 from FNAF World as part of the character selection menu. These two were prominently featured, suggesting they would be hostile characters you'd need to manage, alongside the 50+ other animatronics. However, in the final game, they were replaced by Withered Chica and Withered Bonnie from FNAF 2. Scott confirmed that Candy Cadet and Adventure Endo 01 would still appear in the game but wouldn't be hostile. Candy Cadet made it in, appearing in the FNAF 1 skinned office as one of the props, occasionally flickering with activity and speaking segments of his stories. But Adventure Endo 01 is entirely absent from the final game, despite being shown in the promotional material. Why Adventure Endo 01 was removed entirely while Candy Cadet was kept in a non-hostile role is unclear, but it's another case of promotional materials showing content that didn't make it to release. The character selection icons also went through changes. Based on the first teaser version, Nightmare Freddy and his Freddles were originally going to have separate selection icons, letting you enable them independently. In the final game, they're merged into a single icon because their mechanics are interlinked, and it wouldn't make sense to have one without the other. Similarly, several characters visible in early materials had their icons redesigned or repositioned before release. Bucket Bob, Mr. Hugs, and Number 1 Crate were originally shown in teasers as being part of the standard roster, but were ultimately moved to their own separate icon section. This reorganization clarified their unique nature as more environmental hazards than traditional animatronics, helping players understand how the selection worked. The game's main menu went through a design change as well. An unused custom night text graphic exists in the files, meant to be displayed on the main menu screen. It was removed in favor of having space for the offices, power-ups, and challenges buttons. A practical decision that improved navigation at the expense of that title branding. Interestingly, one of the screenshots on the game's Steam and GameJolt pages still shows the menu with the custom night text, revealing that the screenshot was taken before the design change. There was also an early access demo sent to YouTubers before the game's public release, and files from that demo remain in the final game's code. These include a screen mentioning starting a level when having over 2,000 points, suggesting some kind of progression or unlock system that was either modified or removed for the final version. The final game scoring and unlocks work differently, so this demo screen represents an earlier approach to progression that was simplified. An unusually small desk exists in the game's files as an unused office skin. When zoomed in, you can see brighter lighting and fixed eyebrows for the Freddy plush that sits on the desk, showing that this was a refined asset, not just a rough test. Why this desk was created and then left unused is unknown, but it suggests that more office variations were planned or tested than what made it into the final game. When the FNAF 1 skinned office was first teased in promotional materials, some posters and drawings were horizontally flipped compared to the final version, and objects like the office desk and Freddy's suit prop were positioned differently. These changes show the office skins being refined and adjusted even after being shown to the public, polishing details until the last minute. Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator has less documented, unused content, partly because it was a surprise release without the extended promotional period that leads to discrepancies between teasers and the final product. However, there are still some interesting elements that were planned but not fully realized. Some dialogue and voiceover lines in the files are slightly different from what plays in the game, suggesting script revisions during voice acting or editing. The game's restaurant building mechanics, where you purchase items and design your pizzeria, went through balancing changes. Early versions visible in streams by testers showed different costs and availability for certain items, suggesting the economy was adjusted to make progression feel appropriately challenging without being frustrating. This is standard game balancing, but it's worth noting that the version that released had been tuned from earlier builds where the progression might have been too slow or too fast. The lawsuit system, where you face legal consequences for accidents or poor hygiene, also had its parameters adjusted. The thresholds for triggering lawsuits and the severity of their financial impact were calibrated to create tension without making it too easy to fall into an unrecoverable spiral of debt. Unused values in the code suggest these numbers were tweaked multiple times to find the right balance. While Ultimate Custom Night and Pizzeria Simulator don't have the massive swaths of cut content that games like Security Breach or Help Wanted do, the changes they did undergo are still revealing. Characters were swapped, icons were reorganized, menus were redesigned, and balancing was adjusted. These changes show Scott continuing to refine even when games were close to release, prioritizing the final experience over any particular feature or character that wasn't quite working. The fact that Adventure Endo 01 was cut from Ultimate Custom Night entirely, rather than being relegated to a non-hostile role like Candy Cadet, suggests that either the character's mechanics couldn't be made to work satisfactorily, or that Scott simply decided there were already enough characters and this one wasn't essential. Either way, it's a reminder that even in a game designed to include as many characters as possible, some still didn't make the cut. Channisitzer. The smaller mysteries beyond the major cuts and cancelled projects. The Five Nights at Freddy's franchise has numerous smaller pieces of unused content scattered across various games. These aren't usually game-changing features or central mechanics, but they're interesting glimpses into development choices and refinements that occurred throughout the series. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 and 4 both have their share of minor unused content, though these games are less thoroughly documented than some others. FNAF 3's cut content includes alternate versions of Springtrap's textures and models in the files, showing iterations on his damaged, decayed appearance before settling on the final design. Some of these textures show him as more or less rotted, with different levels of exposure for the corpse inside, and different patterns of damage to the suit. There are also unused audio files in FNAF 3 that appear to be alternate versions of sounds that did make it into the game, recorded with slightly different tones or timings. These might have been earlier takes that were replaced with better recordings, or they might represent sounds that were assigned to different events before the game's design was finalized. Without clear context from file names or code references, it's hard to know their intended purpose, but their presence shows the audio design being iterative. FNAF 4 has some interesting unused mechanics visible in its code. There are variables and checks for nightmare level tracking that aren't fully utilized in the final game, suggesting that the difficulty progression might have been tracked or displayed differently at some point. The nightmare levels in FNAF 4 increase as you progress, but there's code that implies more granular tracking, or possibly a display that would show you exactly how difficult things had become. There's also an unused tutorial value in FNAF 4's files, suggesting that at one point there might have been more explicit instructions or guidance for players learning the game's mechanics. FNAF 4's gameplay is less intuitive than earlier entries, requiring you to listen at doors, check behind you, and manage multiple threats with timing and sound cues. A tutorial system would have helped players understand these mechanics, but it was ultimately removed, leaving FNAF 4 as perhaps the least hand-holding entry in the series. FNAF World, Scott's RPG experiment, had substantial content cut or never finished. The game famously launched on Steam, received negative reviews due to bugs and issues, and was pulled by Scott 4 days later. He then released an altered, improved version on GameJolt for free. The differences between the Steam version and the updated GameJolt version represent cut or revised content, though the exact nature of every change isn't fully documented. What we do know is that the updated version included new characters, revised areas, and rebalanced combat. Some characters that were in the original launch were modified or removed, while others were added. Certain areas of the game's world map were expanded or redesigned. The changes were substantial enough that Scott felt the need to pull the game and re-release it entirely, rather than just patching it, showing how significant the revisions were. FNAF World also has unused character models and animations in its files from both versions, representing characters that were planned but never fully implemented, or that were replaced during development. Given the game's large roster drawing from across the franchise, it's not surprising that some characters didn't make the cut, but it's interesting to see evidence of their partial implementation. Help Wanted 2 has its own minor cuts beyond what was discussed earlier. Unused animations for Glamrock Chica exist in the files, showing her having a stomach ache for when you fail an order in food prep, and striking a victory pose for when you complete an order successfully. These were meant for the pizza level, but were never triggered in the final game, possibly because Steel Wool decided the level didn't need these additional feedback animations, or because they encountered issues implementing them properly. Montgomery Gator has an unused jump scare animation in Help Wanted 2's files meaning he was originally going to be a minigame adversary, but was relegated to a gallery model instead. Why this change was made is unclear. Technical limitations might have prevented his full inclusion, or his mechanics might not have worked well in VR, or he was simply cut for time as Steel Wool focused on finishing other content. There are leftover level icons from the PAX 2023 demo, including an unused terminal icon for Princess Quest IV, implying it was originally meant to be accessible from the main terminal, rather than through the specific sequence of interactions required in the final game. This change might have been to make Princess Quest IV feel more special, requiring players to discover it, rather than having it listed alongside other levels. Across multiple games, there are also recurring types of unused content that reveal common development practices. Debug text and placeholder graphics appear in many games' files, tools that the developers use to test features and track data during development. These assets were disabled or hidden for release, but not fully deleted, leaving them accessible to determined data miners. Camera views and renders that don't appear in the final games exist in several entries, showing angles and perspectives that were captured but not used. These might have been test renders, screenshots for promotional use that were ultimately replaced, or views that were planned for specific sequences before those sequences were redesigned. Character textures and models often have multiple versions in game files, showing iterations on designs. The final version that players see is usually the last in a series of refinements, with earlier versions showing different colors, different levels of damage or wear, or different stylistic approaches. These unused textures are rarely dramatically different from what shipped, but they show the incremental process of perfecting the look of each character. Voice lines and audio files frequently include alternate takes or unused dialogue. Voice actors typically record multiple versions of lines with different emotional inflections or emphases, giving editors options during post-production. The takes that weren't used remain in the files, evidence of the choices made during audio editing. The cumulative effect of all this smaller unused content is a picture of iterative development, where every element, no matter how minor, went through versions and refinements. Even simple sound effects were recorded multiple times. Even straightforward textures had alternate versions. Every visual, every audio cue, every piece of text was the result of choices between options, with the rejected options often remaining in the files as artifacts. These smaller mysteries and cuts don't change the games in fundamental ways like the removed gameplay mechanics or cancelled projects do, but they contribute to the overall understanding that what players experience is just one possibility among many that were tested during development. Each game could have looked slightly different, sounded different, felt different if different versions of assets had been chosen. The final products are the culmination of countless small decisions, and the unused content that remains shows us the paths not taken at every level of detail. Conclusion: the value of what's left behind. We've journeyed through years of abandoned concepts, from the beaver and wolf animatronics that were never meant to stalk us, through the life system and toxic meters that would have changed fundamental gameplay, past entire game modes and projects that were announced and then shelved, to the massive amounts of content cut from Security Breach that reveal an entirely different version of that game. Along the way, we've encountered movie scripts that took the story in bizarre directions, character models that exist but never appear, voice lines recorded but never triggered, and systems coded but never activated. What does all of this cut content tell us? First, it reveals that game development, even for a series as seemingly straightforward as Five Nights at Freddy's, is complex and unpredictable. Features that seem essential are cut. Characters that are almost finished are replaced. Entire mechanical systems are disabled. Projects are cancelled after being announced. This isn't unique to FNAF, but the franchise's unusual transparency about these processes, thanks to Scott's willingness to discuss scrapped ideas and data miners' ability to find unused assets, gives us an unusually clear view of how much work goes into making games and how much of that work never sees the light of day. Second, the cut content shows the importance of refinement and the courage to abandon completed work when it doesn't serve the vision. Scott Cawthon and the developers he worked with built features, recorded dialogue, modeled characters, and designed systems that were then discarded because they weren't quite right. That willingness to cut even when it means wasting effort is part of what made the FNAF games effective. The toxic meter worked functionally but felt artificial, so it was cut. The beaver animatronic was modeled but resembled Chipper too closely, so it was replaced. Into Madness was announced but didn't fit development priorities, so it was shelved. Third, unused content reveals alternate histories, roads not traveled that would have led to very different experiences. If the beaver had been the main antagonist instead of Freddy Fazbear, would the franchise still have succeeded? If FNAF 1 had kept the live system, would it have been scary enough to catch on? If Security Breach had kept Vanny's spawning mechanic and included the full roster of cut features, would it have been a better game? Or would it have been too ambitious to run properly on anyone's hardware? These questions don't have definitive answers, but they're worth pondering because they show how contingent success is on specific choices. Fourth, the cut content is a reminder that what we experience as players is carefully curated. The games feel cohesive and purposeful because everything that didn't fit has been removed. We never see the half-finished ideas, the mechanics that almost worked, the characters that were almost right. We experience the end result of a filtering process, and that filtering is part of what makes the games worth playing. The cut content exists in the margins, visible only to those who go looking, but its removal is essential to the quality of what remains. Finally, all of this unused material has value beyond historical curiosity. It inspires fan projects. Developers look at the cut racing and bowling minigames from Security Breach and create mods that implement them. Artists see concept art for unused characters and create interpretations of what those characters would look like fully realized. Storytellers weave narratives that explain why certain features were removed within the lore of the games themselves. The cut content becomes source material for a creative community, raw material that can be reimagined and repurposed. The Five Nights at Freddy's franchise has always encouraged fan participation and creativity. Scott has supported fan games, engaged with theories, and embraced the community's interpretations of his work. The cut content fits naturally into this ecosystem, providing fans with insights into the development process and elements they can incorporate into their own projects. In a sense, nothing is truly cut if the community finds it and gives it new life. As we finish this exploration of scrapped FNAF ideas, it's worth reflecting on the nature of creation itself. Every creative project, whether it's a game, a film, a book, or anything else, involves choices about what to include and what to exclude. The final product is shaped as much by what's removed as by what's added. FNAF's cut content is extensive, but is proportional to the franchise's ambition and prolific output. Scott Cawthon and his collaborators tried many things, kept what worked, and discarded what didn't, and we're left with both the successful games and the ghostly traces of what almost was. So whether you're drifting off to sleep, letting these ideas wash over you, or you're wide awake, taking mental notes about all these lost pieces of FNAF history, I hope this journey through the franchise's discarded content has been illuminating. We've seen how much effort goes into creating games, how many paths are tested before finding the right one, and how even seemingly small decisions can have major impacts on the final experience. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into Five Nights at Freddy's cut content, consider liking this video and subscribing to Night Mode Lore for more comprehensive, sleep-friendly explorations of gaming mysteries, lore, and development histories. There's always more to discover in the shadows behind the scenes, more stories about what almost was, more insights into the creative process that brings games to life. And as the FNAF franchise continues to evolve with new entries, new books, new movies, there will inevitably be more cut content to examine, more features that almost made it, more glimpses into alternate timelines where different decisions led to different games. The history of what was scrapped from Five Nights at Freddy's is almost as extensive as the history of what made it into the games, and exploring both gives us a fuller picture of this franchise that has captivated millions of fans. Every animatronic that was cut, every mechanic that was disabled, every game that was cancelled, contributed to shaping what we actually got to play, and that's worth acknowledging and appreciating, even as we wonder what might have been if different choices had been made. Thanks for joining me on this exploration of every scrapped FNAF idea you've never heard of, and until next time, pleasant dreams or good learning, wherever this finds you in your journey through the night.